Welcome to another edition of Revive and Thrive. This is episode number 27, and I'm your host, Joshua Blum. For the past half year, we've been going through the alphabet A to Z, talking about a different aspect and a series of actionable steps to help combat physician burnout, specifically for fathers. And this is our last episode that basically summarizes what we've been doing over the past half year. The original goal was to start at A and work our way to Z. And we have accomplished that. One of the things that I mentioned initially, however, is that the goal wasn't necessarily to provide specific answers. It can't really. That would be pretty presumptuous for anybody to think that, for anybody who is doing something like this, to say like, well, I have answers for you. There might be answers, but everybody's situation is a little bit different. All I could really do or hope to do would be to spark some ideas and plant a couple of seeds that hopefully you can take and run with. Each episode was intended to be standalone, meaning you don't necessarily need to listen to the previous episodes to get something out of it. What we're going to be doing today is synthesizing things, and then you're going to start to see that many of them do tie back to each other in various ways. And that was intentional because, just as you may have heard in medical school, if something is important, you're probably going to hear it more than once. And many of the things that we talk about, ultimately, they're variations on the same theme. If this is your first time listening, this is actually a great place to start because it's a little bit like a chapter summary at the end of a textbook chapter. It gives you a series of bullet points, like a Cliff Notes outline for all the stuff that we've talked about before. And you can pick and choose what you think may be helpful, what you think you want to delve into further. So let's start. Episode 1 is for A, and A was for aim. If we know where we want to end up, we're less likely to get lost along the way. Our why of why we do things is so critically important because it helps to give us an idea about what's important and what we can shed in terms of baggage. It doesn't align with our particular purpose. Often when we're burned out, we can kind of see where we want to go, but a lot of things get in the way. And when we're clear on what we want, when we're clear on the things that are really important to us, it becomes easier to get rid of some of those things. Some of the actionable steps that we talked about here are asking yourself very, very simple questions. They're not easy, but, why did you go into medicine? Why did you pick your particular specialty? Where do you want to see your life going? How does your particular life as it is right now align with these goals? When they don't align, that's often where the frustration, the seeds of burnout often start. I picked this to start with because in some ways, although they're simple questions and they're obvious questions, they're in some ways the most difficult questions. And you may not actually have great answers for them. Or the answers that you have are not really actual answers for you, meaning like maybe you picked medicine because somebody else wanted you to go into it. But at this point in time, you fulfilled that desire. So now, what is your role in continuing to do it? That's just an example, right? So many of the other subsequent episodes will kind of tie back to this core clarity of purpose in various ways. And as you refine it and become clearer and clearer, it becomes easier to kind of say what's important versus what's not, what you want versus what you don't want. Episode 2 was B, and B is for boundary. So the idea is that we need some protected pockets of time. It could be a few seconds, it could be a few minutes, it could be a few hours, but we talked about how to go about doing that and eking that out in your day-to-day life. Some of the actionable steps there were setting aside some protected pockets of time for what you actually want to do, not necessarily for what other people expect of you or want you to do, but what actually you want to do. Although we often will say, well, I don't have time for this or that, we make time for what's important for us. So these pockets of time do exist, even if they are very, very small. But it's okay to start small. That may be the only way to do it. Any actionable step is going to probably start small enough so that you can do it consistently. Episode 3, the letter C, is for company. A company we keep determines a lot about our outlook. So if you're around a lot of negative people, chances are you're going to be negative yourself, and vice versa. Some of the actionable steps we talked about there are, again, some fairly large questions here. Again, may seem simple, but they are important, not necessarily easy. Who in your life do you want to be a part of it. You may not necessarily be able to cut out all the people who are negative, but at least identifying who those people are and then figuring out who you actually want to surround yourself with is important, because some of those people may in fact not be people that you actually can know in day-to-day life. They might be people who are historical figures, maybe people that you admire, that you can sort of only know virtually. They still may influence you. There may be people whose books you've read, podcasts you've listened to, movies, films, documentaries you've watched, whatever. Those kind of people, those kind of role models, whether they're dead, alive, or in person, or virtual, or whatever, are all people to think about as your sort of circle, your sort of inner circle of people that are there to help you, inspire you, and support you. Episode 4 was the letter D, and D stands for deficit. So we all have things we're not good at, and identifying those in your work, or they could be in your parenting life, things that we tend to get frustrated by. If we can work on those areas, then it's going to just help us grow. We tend to not want to work on areas that we're weak in, but if you work on it, you won't be weak in it anymore. Sometimes our kids expect us to know everything, but often people get into a thing physician-wise where their patients expect them to know everything. But patients also respect when you say, I don't know. You're human and you're not expected to know everything, and you're going to make some mistakes. I think when it comes to this idea of failure, often we learn a lot through not getting things correct. And failure is not necessarily something to be avoided, because you often will learn a lot from it if you can capitalize on it. So I don't necessarily consider something a failure if you've actually taken something and learned something from it. I wouldn't consider that a failure. And those are kind of steps that are necessary for progress. So some actionable steps we talked about are looking for areas in your life that are weaknesses that you can improve on. Sounds simple enough, right? But not necessarily easy. Now, you don't have to do it alone. You may be able to seek out people or resources that you can use to work on those skills. And then, of course, figuring out ways that you're going to actually do this on a regular and consistent basis. So one example might be having some goals for each clinic day, or each time you go and see a patient, for example, some little thing that you want to work on. So even if it all goes to hell, then at least you worked on something that's going to help you be better in the future. Episode 5 is letter E. So E stands for emotions. Often we're taught to suppress emotions in medicine, or maintain some professional distance. That has its place, of course. However, sometimes that gets to be habitual in not the greatest way. As we'll touch upon and have touched upon in previous episodes, what is often habitual is not necessarily best. It's just what we're used to doing. We can get used to just about anything. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us, though. All right, so learning to identify our own emotional responses, especially if they're overly strong in a negative way and we don't like how they command our life, is probably a good first step. You can only bury things so long before they start to be viewed as not important and you ignore them. But the problem is that when you start to bury things too long, it doesn't necessarily mean they go away. They just come back in various other forms, as we've talked about in previous episodes, and we'll again touch on in this summary episode. So trying to recognize when your decisions are being ruled by emotions, as opposed to your ideals and your aim, as referring to episode 1, is one of the steps in living a fuller, richer, and more intentional life, which doesn't necessarily mean things are going to be always comfortable, right? Some discomfort is not necessarily bad. And of course, the status quo, conversely, is not necessarily always good. It's all about kind of what aligns with, again, your particular goals. So, although, again, this may sound simple, being able to actually identify emotions, especially negative ones, is important to us. So at least we have a vocabulary to describe what's going on with us internally. Pausing, taking 5 minutes or 5 moments or whatever when you encounter a crisis from other people is helpful. Pushing the envelope, especially in areas that are uncomfortable, like, for example, practicing things like negotiation, things you're otherwise nervous about, and finding ways to diffuse some negative emotions so they don't necessarily eat you up. Finding ways to diffuse them in ways that are productive, such as through exercise and so forth, is a good thing to do, as opposed to burying them. They only come back up later. In episode 6, we talked about letter F. F stands for freedom. So being pulled in multiple directions at a time is sort of what happens a lot as physicians and as fathers, right? That may be the norm, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to like it. One of the actionable steps we talked about here was looking at the different domains of our life, all the different things that kind of make us us. For example, assigning each domain a different number based on how either bothersome it is or how much of a joy it is. And then imagine, basically each domain of your life as a spoke of a wheel. And if you imagine like a wagon wheel or a bike wheel, the spokes have to be roughly the same length in order for the whole thing to be true. In other words, roll smoothly. If there are certain spokes that are longer or shorter than the others, and that's going to mean that those imbalances are going to make your wheel roll less smoothly. So can you identify those and figure out if there is something you can do to balance them? And we're going to be talking about that in a future episode. Recognizing them is a first step. Episode 7 is the letter G. So G is the GI system. And as a lot of you folks who do GI know quite well, GI health and mental health are very closely related. Sometimes clues about what happens in our GI system will clue you into your mental state. And there's lots of other areas of our bodies that will do this. We tend to silo things in medicine, but it doesn't necessarily actually represent reality. That's just done for our convenience, right? And this is an example of that. So some of the actionable steps that we talked about there are actually eating lunch, actually eating during your workday. Trying not to work at the same time. And if that sounds crazy to you, it's one of those things, you got to just try it. That's a time that, again, it goes back to the episode on protected time. This is a time when it is for you. Protect it. Do whatever you want during that time, but try not working at that time. Then the same goes for other points in the day. Working to protect meal time so you have fuel in order to function is helpful. Again, sounds overly obvious. Surprisingly, how seldom it's done. Episode 8 is about H for hours. So we only have so much time in our day and in our lives. So again, how do we actually want to use it in such a way that is actually important to us and what we want to get done? Again, it goes back to our clarity of purpose. These are questions in our steps about, again, how do we want to use our time? How do we currently spend our time? And maybe a mismatch there. And it's important to do this for both your work and non-work life, and noticing areas of inefficiency that may get in the way. And again, this goes back to the very first episode where we talked about our why, because that'll help to trim the fat, so to speak, and figure out, are there certain things that you're spending your time on that are really not that important in the grand scheme of things? Episode 9 is the letter I. So I stands for individuation. So in a group setting, people tend to resort to the default role they had in their family of origin. And so part of the process of separating from your family is this process of individuation. Now, again, this is sort of culture specific, probably more of a Western concept than others, but still, if we're talking about individuals, eventually in adulthood, people get to the point where they may not necessarily adopt all of the values that their families of origin had. And it's important to kind of figure out what you want versus what you don't want. Again, it goes back to clarity of purpose. Thinking about the role you had in your family of origin is helpful. And then do you find yourself adopting the same role in other group settings? Being the clown, being the peacemaker, being the shoulder to cry on, whatever it is. Because again, once you become aware of that, then you actually have a chance of maybe doing something about it, especially if it's not a role that you particularly relish. Again, this is one of those things that's actually really helpful if you have siblings and they are of adult age. It's something that actually can be very helpful to do with siblings, because at the end of the day, you're probably the only ones that really understand what it was like to grow up in your family. All families have some pluses and minuses. There's no perfect one. When you do this sort of exercise with people who actually know what it was like, where there's less explaining that needs to happen, you can really get a lot out of it. However, if you don't have any siblings, it's something you can totally do by yourself. And you can often get some clues as to how you do this by looking at other, basically surrogate families, other group settings where people kind of resort to those roles. And so the workplace for many people is one such place. And so that's why burnout issues will often tie back in some way to the way that you operated in your home. All right, so next one is episode 10, and in 10 we talked about J for join. So in mental health circles, we often have this saying that if you've hit a wall with a patient, sometimes the right people are not in the room. So joining together with your support network and the other quote-unquote right people in your life can be really helpful for your happiness and also your success. This kind of goes back to the previous episode when we talked about who do you want in your sort of inner circle, right? Again, another variation on the same theme of a support network of some kind. We talked about mentorship some in this episode. Again, they probably are around. They may not formally call themselves mentors, and you may not necessarily establish a formal mentor-mentee relationship, but those mentors are there to help and guide you. You may have to look for them, I will say, but it is probably easier to do that now than it may have been sometime in the past, so take advantage of that. In episode 11, we talked about the letter K. K was for kids. Being a father is probably a big part of your identity. Children are a joy, but they're also quite a lot of work. Again, this is one of those things that's going to come back again and again, but the way that children approach the world is often different than the way adults approach the world. In this particular episode, we talked about something called the beginner's mind, and it's sort of this fresh, open way of looking at things. It's a little bit like how children approach the world because they're exploring everything that they see. It's all new to them. And when we approach things in that particular way, we see things with fresh perspectives. And sometimes when we're busy adulting, we get into a rut. And again, sort of a parallel to burnout. So when you're with your children, this is part of the actionable part of it, try seeing things from their perspective as a way of practicing a childlike way of looking at things. Play with them on the floor when they're doing it. Ask why. But don't necessarily get upset if they can't give you a response to a particular question, because children don't necessarily know how to answer adults' questions all that well. But sometimes making a random statement or framing what you want to know as a statement sometimes can get you a lot further. But either way, you may discover that in their perspectives, you may discover a different, more imaginative way of looking at things. And that's something we're going to be talking about in episode 23. In episode 12, we talked about L for love. We'll do a lot for the people we love. We'll sacrifice all kinds of things. So again, this goes back to purpose and passion. So identifying ways to maintain passions in your life, even for a little bit, that's really important because, again, it ties back to our purpose. Why do we do the things we do, and why do we devote the time to certain things we do? Again, probably it's because either we want to do it or we feel you need to. Now, when you need to and want to, when those goals align, then that's great, but they don't always, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about. Are the things you want to do and the things you need to do, can you realign them in some way? So the other thing we talked about is a form of self-love is working on yourself to make yourself, one, a better partner, a better father, a better person in general. So when you take time and invest time in yourself, sometimes that gets seen as people feel guilty about it because they say, well, like I'm taking time for myself and I should be devoting it to other people. But this is one of those cases where it's not necessarily bad. I mean, again, this is maybe a Western way of looking at things in some regard. Selfishness in this regard is not necessarily bad or toxic. As we mentioned earlier, what doesn't get fulfilled will often just come up later. And when we negate basic needs like love or self-respect, it doesn't necessarily mean that they go away. It just means that they come out in a different form later. If we ignore sleep, if we ignore hunger, again, those doesn't make it go away. It just pushes it off until later, and it may come back stronger in the future. So it's helpful to think about, what have you given up in order to be a physician, a husband, a father, whatever else that you've accomplished. Be honest, because no one really accomplishes anything, especially anything that's worthwhile, without some sacrifice. When you've given up certain things that help keep you centered and more whole as a person, however, that doesn't necessarily mean that they go away. So we all have certain basic needs, basic desires, and so it's often really helpful to find healthy ways to address these needs, or again, they only come back later, possibly more urgently or destructively. Reintegrating some of those things into your life is helpful, but it doesn't necessarily have to occupy a huge chunk of time. It could be just a little bit at a time. Any habit that you make is going to be probably something you can do consistently. And in order to do something consistently, it's probably going to need to start in a very small way. Episode 13 was about M for means to an end. So sometimes despite our best efforts, we really can't change things about our work environment or home environment. Often there's systemic things that make things difficult. And, this whole podcast is sort of working on the assumption that there's a lot of environmental stuff you really can't change. However, can you change things about yourself, how you do things, how you think about things, that may make it a little bit better, right? If there's things you cannot change, then it's all the more important that the other areas of your life that you have more control over, you actually leverage those. Finding things or remembering or reintegrating things that are actually more fulfilling. Well, basically you bide your time and wait for and plan for something better to come in the future is helpful. Sometimes all you can do is wait, right? In medicine, we call that watchful waiting. You do what you can, and then it's time to wait and observe. If you didn't do the spokes of the wheel exercise from episode 6 then, now is actually a great time to do it. And because before, really what we were doing is just identifying areas of imbalance, now it's time to actually take it a step further. So if you are spending too much time on something like medicine or as a parent or whatever, if you weren't doing those things, for example, what would you be doing instead? And these, in fact, may be things that you've negated or pushed away or whatever in the interest of spending more time as a physician or as a father or whatever it is, right? Just because you're not doing something doesn't mean it's not necessarily important to your well-being. And what can you do to renegotiate, rebalance the levels of these things, the spokes of your wheel, so that they start to roll more smoothly? I don't know if any of us achieve a truly balanced life where that wheel rolls totally smoothly, but can you shift things around a little bit, shuffle them around so that the time you spend with these things are a little less lopsided, hopefully to rebalance your life to be a little bit more sustaining for you as opposed to other people. Episode 14, N was for narcissism. Narcissism is something that typically has negative connotations, rightfully so. But when we think about healthy narcissism, that's also self-esteem. So it kind of depends on how we look at it. Again, this goes back to our own unmet needs. So for people that are narcissistic in a personality disorder kind of way, usually they have an unmet need for self-regard, self-respect, love, those kind of things like that. It's sort of a black hole that doesn't get filled, usually because it wasn't filled earlier on in life. And so they go out seeking it and they can't find it. And so they tend to pile it on themselves. When we go and recognize our own unmet needs, it really does help in various ways in helping to combat burnout. It may not fix it entirely, but it helps. And for many physicians, here's the kicker of it, the need to be helpful and be appreciated for what we do can be an unmet need. And the same thing you could say as a parent. And sometimes what that will mean, though, particularly for physicians, is that if they're not necessarily getting the same kind of respect or same kind of regard, they may take on more and more responsibility going up and up the ladder in order to get it. That just often means more work, so that may further burnout. However, the flip side of it is that if that is sustaining for you and that makes you feel better, then it may not. So it really depends on your why, your passion, the thing that you find most important. Here's the actionable step. If you by default tend to say no to everything, then consider what would happen if you actually said yes to certain things, and then vice versa. So the important part, however, not really in the saying yes versus no, it really is the why. You say yes or no by default, and understanding that will often tell you a lot about your underlying motivations and the things that drive you. And again, that goes back to these underlying needs. So episode 15 is about O. O was for O-ring. As we talked about in that episode, machines often depend on gaskets or O-rings to form an airtight seal, especially if there's fluids or gases involved. The whole point of this is that these O-rings are cheap, they're flexible, they're compressible, and they're also expendable. And they rely on basically deformation or self-destruction in some cases to actually form that airtight seal. In any organization, there are often people that function in the very same way. Those are often very high turnover roles. Sometimes jobs are set up in a way so that it doesn't really matter. As long as there's a steady stream of people coming in, it doesn't really matter how long we get from somebody. Keep them as long as we can, and then when they burn out, then there'll be another one. I would say don't be those people. Don't take those jobs. Don't be the gasket. You're setting yourself up for self-destruction, and recognizing that that happens and that you may find yourself in the role sometimes seems a little bit jaded, but if you find yourself functioning as a gasket in your home or medical life, then consider this. The next time you feel pushed into that role, taking on extra responsibility you didn't sign up for, practice being a little bit difficult, asking why. You don't even need to say no, but ask why. Ask people for justification. I think many of us, if you've been through medical school and residency, you've learned to justify your plan that you made with patients. You don't necessarily need to be right in your assessment, but you do need to be able to justify why you thought what you did and why you did what you did. You were working the best you could with the information you had. Sometimes that's not necessarily always the correct thing. But as long as you can justify why you did what you did, then you at least have a chance to understand it and change it in the future when things don't necessarily go well. When you push back a little bit, then hopefully that'll give you a little bit of leeway so that even if there really isn't any change you can make there, you'll at least be able to feel like you made a more informed decision as opposed to being shunted into something where you had no say in the matter. In episode 16, we talked about the letter P. P stands for posture. So ideally, outside should reflect the inside, but the whole idea of this episode was that when you focus on something that is very concrete, in this case, your posture, you may have stand a chance in minimizing some of the effects of chronic pain that comes from neck and back and shoulder discomfort. And those are the same areas that tend to tighten up when we're in chronic stressful situations. The other thing is that sitting in particular tends to tighten up a lot of those areas. Being hunched over a desk or a computer screen will often do the same thing. Those kind of situations come up a lot in our work. We're often sitting hunched over a desk, typing on a computer, and medicine can be quite stressful. So you put those two together and you have the perfect storm for neck and lower back pain in particular. Paying attention to your posture is a small little thing you can do for your health that you can really do throughout the day. The correct position, and this is one that we touched upon in this episode and we'll touch upon again in a future episode in a minute, is that this is the one that requires the least amount of work for your body. The one where your knees, ankles, hips, shoulders, and ears are all in alignment. The other thing we talked about is that, if you happen to carry your children on you, like in a carrier, this is something that will throw the balance off in your body. Just like we talked about balance in various aspects of your life, your spine is an area that likes to have balance in it, as do so many other areas in your body. The change in weight distribution from carrying a child may exacerbate this issue, and so it may put additional strain on areas like your lower back. It's just helpful to recognize that and spend more time either balancing the load, taking more breaks, or working to correct whatever muscle imbalances may be present. And seeing a physical therapist may be very helpful in helping you identify some of those areas of imbalance. In episode 17, we talked about the letter Q. So Q is for question. Being curious is helpful for many of these things. Often when people are burned out, the last thing they want to do is ask why, but in some ways the asking of why may actually help them be less burned out. And sometimes curiosity is the only thing you can offer. As we talked about in just a few moments ago, sometimes being a little bit more difficult when people are telling you to do something and asking why can be helpful. Because it gets them to think about what they're asking you to do. And sometimes they don't want to put up with it and they'll just do it themselves. But also, it means that they may actually recognize things that are unreasonable as well. So thinking about when was the last time you challenged or questioned one of your superiors? Asking why is not just about protecting yourself, although obviously it is that to some degree, but sometimes it's about being able to be your best self at work and elsewhere. Because when we ask why, it again gets us back to our core purpose of why we're doing things. And here's an example exercise. So asking why at least 5 times to get to a real reason about why we're doing something or not doing something is often a great way to actually get to a core set of issues that are actually driving our behavior. In episode 18, we talked about the letter R. R is for ready. You stay ready, you don't need to get ready. But what does that mean to you in a positive sense, particularly when it comes to masculinity? What sort of views on being a man do you want to pass on to your children, whether they're male, whether they're female, or whatever? So this is an episode on incorporating these things into your life. And we also talked about some more concrete things like how do you incorporate being physically ready in your life as a way of maintaining aspects of your physiology and therefore your overall health. And so some of the actionable steps in this episode were, as a father, what sort of practical skills do you want to impart to your children? Sometimes this will cause you to have to learn certain things in order to teach them. By, of course, teaching, you will, of course, learn things more thoroughly. We'd also, when we talked about the physical side of things, incorporating little bits of movement, especially in a professional capacity where you may be sitting or standing for long periods into your day, is a good practice. Again, you want to start with what you have and what you can actually do. A lot of what happens as people get older is they move less. And part of that probably comes from less energy, more pain, but moving in various ways helps you stay limber and helps you feel younger. So keep going, keep moving forward. In episode 19, S is for story. So the story that we tell about ourselves is important because we all have a certain story. Our families all have certain stories about why they do what they do. We talked about this idea of intergenerational trauma and how that influences how families think about things and what kinds of values they pass on to their children. The actionable step here is, what kind of story do you want to pass on to your kids? We can't change the past, obviously, but sometimes we can change how we think about the stories that happened, because when we understand that and we can think about them in ways that fit with us and our values, it's one, easier to forgive past mistakes that may have happened, but also two, we can learn from them and we can say this happened in the past and these are things that let's try to make better in the future. In episode 20, we talked about T. T stands for tension, basically chronic musculoskeletal tension. And so we alluded to this before. When we talk about, again, we talked about posture before. One thing that is tied to is often chronic emotional tension that we've not let go of in particular areas, especially in our midline. So areas like our jaw, neck, chest, shoulders, lower back. These are areas that tend to tighten up as a protective response to vulnerable parts of your body. We talk about some of the mechanisms of why that is, but it's helpful often to start to tune into these areas that maybe get tight in your body. Again, like I mentioned, they're often around midline areas. And, noticing, are these areas that tend to worsen in pain when you're more stressed or in certain difficult situations? Or ones that are again habitual but not necessarily great for your body, like a lot of time spent sitting. Working on these areas will tend to feed backwards into the mental side of things, because when we do things like change our position periodically, one, we're getting more blood flow to those areas, but we're also loosening up those areas so there is less need for them to stay chronically tight. Because we're doing things actively to relax those areas. And part of the reason why they get tight is a protective response. And so when we're making these positive changes, we're telling our bodies in various ways and our minds that, hey, you know what? It's okay. We got this. We're taking steps to make things a little bit better. In episode 21, we talked about the letter U. U is for understanding. Understanding what is going on is not really enough. We have to take action. We can have all the information in the world, but it doesn't really help us very much unless you do something with it. However, even if we make the wrong step, because sometimes people don't take action because they're worried about making mistakes. As we alluded to before, failure really, I think, is only if you don't do anything with some of these missteps. Missteps can be incredibly positive because even if they don't lead you to a place you want to go, they create some momentum. And they can be areas of growth if you actually learn from them. And sometimes you actually learn more from the mistakes than you do from the successes, I guess you could say. We all need to make mistakes. We need to, the process of going forward is not necessarily linear. Well, I wouldn't necessarily be in so much of a hurry to skip over aspects of struggle with yourself or your children, since understanding what is wrong and knowing what actually is happening based on your actual experience are sort of two different things. Right? Book learning versus experiential learning. In episode 22, we talked about the letter V. So V in here stands for visualization. Practicing positive mental visualization of what we actually want to happen is one way to actually first see it in our mind's eye and then actually sow the seeds for positive change. It's a form of meditation. So there's a couple examples we talked about and ways of using visualization to affect positive change and some stories that went with it. Some of the steps here are seeing yourself doing a skill or doing well in a particular situation that's difficult for you in your mind's eye is not only a way to practice that skill you're working on, but also a great way to sow the seeds for future success. When it comes to things that we need to practice multiple times in order to get them right, you may actually not be able to practice certain skills enough. This, for example, like a medical procedure, for them to become fluid, it just may not be practical to do that. But you can do it a unlimited number of times in your mind's playing field. And there's harnessing the power of your imagination can be very helpful in this way, because literally you can practice anytime. Episode 23, W stands for whimsy. A great way of combating burnout is actually alluded to in the previous episode through imagination. Injecting a little bit of fun back into your work is very helpful because a lot of what we do is serious, whether it's being a father or being a physician. It's serious stuff, and there's no real getting around that. But however, if we can make it more fun and more enjoyable, we often like it more, and we're less likely to burn out. As you may have figured out by now, burnout is not necessarily something that gets a whole lot better if it is ignored. We often need to take the bull by the horns, and the core part of our work, whatever it is that's central to the burnout, that part has to be better first. So in other words, you can do things to make the periphery better. You can take more time off, and you can make working conditions better and so forth, more comfortable. But if the actual work part itself, if the job part of it, whether we're talking about parenting or whether we're talking about being a physician, if that part is not better, then it's very hard for burnout to get better as a whole. And so when we think about things that are fun, what are whimsical, it's kind of like the childlike mind that we talked about before. If you look at, there's a couple of films, like the film Big from 1988 with Tom Hanks, or Elf. There's something attractive about those characters who are essentially like big kids. They maintain an air of childlike wonder about them, and they're attractive to other people around them who have lost that to some degree, and these characters help them find it again. In episode 24, we talked about the letter X. I used the Chinese romanization for thank you, 谢谢, in this case, because I wanted to do an episode on thank you and gratitude. In Mandarin Chinese, the way that's written in English is XIE, so I kind of cheated there, but there you go. We discussed being thankful for what you have, reframing negatives into positives, and how negatives and positives often will coexist in the same whole. And it's often in adulthood we get much better at integrating those two together and not necessarily seeing things in a totally black and white kind of form. Thinking about, what are you grateful for? Are there things in your life that you tend to look at in very positive or negative or black and white terms that really kind of cuts out a lot of the gray, the nuance in life? Because in that gray, there's a lot of potential to learn and to grow. A lot of this podcast is really about change, right? And making small little steps, right? And so changing is definitely possible, of course, but the first step is actually recognizing that it can actually happen. And are there aspects of your day-to-day work as a physician or as a father that you tend to take granted that you like to remember and be thankful for? And so that's actually really, really helpful to think about, to actually be cognizant of the changes that you're actually making. I mean, sometimes it can be very helpful. This is in professional capacity for our patients to see, like, here's where you started. Here's where you are right now. There's actually some progress or some change that has happened in this time. You may think that nothing is better, but let's look at it. Is it actually the case? And you may discover that things are different. Episode 25, we talked about the letter Y. Y is for yearning. As adults, we get beaten down by life to some degree sometimes. And, we sometimes tend to bury our dreams. It's important to remember to have those dreams and not necessarily push them aside, but doubly so, and this is the adult part of it, is that it's important to take action on those dreams to actually make them a reality. So what aspirations do you have for your life, either it's work or home or whatever, that you may have given up in the interest of being sensible, being an adult? Sometimes we stop doing things because we think we're too old or slow or uncoordinated or tired or whatever that we used to really like doing. And would it be possible to reintegrate or retry some of those things, maybe potentially with your children or other people in your family, that you could now do at a different phase of your life? Yes, you may not be able to do it in the same way that you did before, but then you're not the same person you were before. And then episode number 26, this is the letter Z. In the letter Z, Z stands for zebra. We were probably taught in medical school that hoofbeats means horses, not zebras, but every now and then you get a zebra. And we tend to miss it if we think very algorithmically. Being flexible, being open-minded in how we think, being less algorithmic, and leaving room for the occasional zebra to pop up is helpful, because it really goes back to the basics of how we tend to think in terms of differential diagnosis and things like that. But it helps to inject this sense of possibility and maybe a little bit of wonder into our day-to-day life. When we get too locked into thinking that things are always a certain way, black and white, we tend to lose some of the zest, the spice. And when we recognize that that's actually happening and things are becoming overly rote, it's helpful to shake those things up a bit. So that is the 26 episodes in a nutshell. If this is your first time listening, most episodes are actually about 15 minutes long. But going through them all today, it's obviously a little bit longer. So where to from here? So you may have observed that many of these episodes kind of go through very, very similar themes, because that's true. They are very similar. A lot of the core issues about who you are, what you want, and what your passions are expressed in lots of different ways, but they're all kind of getting at those core things, because ultimately, when we get burnt out, we lose some of that. So it's helpful to reinvigorate our lives by adding that passion back in. It may not be possible in all ways, but can you do it in even small ways? Even a 1 or 2% difference in some way is better than nothing. What actually causes us to change? If you look at evolution as a whole, if you look at how things happen over the course of time on Earth, it often wasn't a steady progression. There often would be periods of time when things would be basically unchanged for long stretches, and then there would be something that would shake things up. Maybe it's like an ice age or something like that, a crisis, so to speak, that would cause the system as a whole to have to change very rapidly. So this idea of punctuated equilibrium is one that you often see in the history of this earth, and also throughout a lot of human history, that things often maintain their status quo for a long time. Like I mentioned before, we can get used to just about everything. But there will come a point where you have to change because it's gotten so unbearable that the idea of maintaining the status quo is no longer acceptable. And that's when the revolution happens. That's when the explosion happens. That's when we decide we got to do it. One of the things I hope that you've gotten out of this podcast is the idea that change is possible, of course, but also that it's possible to do that just by starting very small and starting now. When we reach a point of burnout, that is often kind of like that crisis point, that punctuated equilibrium example where the ice age is happening, and now, because of this crisis in the environment, everything else has to change. What has worked up to now is no longer working, and so we have to make adjustments in order for it to happen in a new way, to adjust for this new environment. And so I think many times when we're reaching a point of burnout, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's our body, mind, whatever, is putting on the brakes and saying, well, you can't do this anymore. We've reached a point where we've hit a wall. It's time to make a change. We have to find a new equilibrium to get to. And these are just 26 ideas about how to go about doing it. There's many, many more. But I don't necessarily think burnout is something to be feared or avoided. In some ways, it's the natural progression of what happens. As we talked about before, if there's no struggle, you're probably not making progress. If any of you tried things like skiing or skating or whatever, if you're not falling, then you're probably not getting better. If you're not pushing yourself, again, you're not getting better. And so when we get to those points, recognize that, because we tend to think of it as a negative thing. I don't think it's necessarily negative. It's probably, again, only negative if we ignore it and try to make it pretend that it's not actually happening. As I mentioned before, you ignore basic needs, they only come back later. So burnout, again, is one of those things that I think it could be a similar parallel where we ignore it up to a certain point until we can't anymore. It's the natural progression, I think, for us actually improving and making positive changes in our life. So if that resonates to you, then pass this on to somebody else. The whole point of this was never about liking and subscribing and building a social following. It was more about, if you find it helpful, then hopefully you can take some of these things and run with them and share it with other people, because they'll have different things will probably work for them. But hopefully it'll help inspire them to make positive changes in their life. It's been a pleasure talking with you and working with you this past half year. Thank you. And if our paths should cross again, I look forward to it. Best of luck.